Greetings. Welcome to another edition of the Brattlecast. This is Jordan Rich. Brattlecast, the podcast that brings a first-hand look to secondhand books and so much more, with Ken Gloss, the proprietor and the man behind it all, the Brattle Bookshop in Boston on West Street. It's a great institution. Now, recently we talked about, of all things, Alcatraz. Now, how does that relate? Had to do with Bookplates, and somebody, of course, followed up, as people do all the time now with Brattlecast listening, and wanted to know more about Bookplates. Why don't you bring us up to date on what a bookplate is, and then we'll get into the person's...
Well, what a bookplate is you have a printed piece of paper. A lot of times, what a lot of people might be familiar with, when you go to the library and there's a pasted-in plate that says the Boston Public Library, the Chicago Public Library, pasted in the front. That's a book plate. In many cases, it's not something you necessarily want in a book because people want their own personalized items. And book plates go back, books, especially when they first started coming out, printed in the 1400s, but even before that, the hand-done were very, very expensive items. They were luxury items. And people would put their own ownership plate. Basically, that's what a book plate is. And people who were really collecting widely would many times have an artist, an engraver, a printer, print out a whole group of book plates so they could put them in their books. And so you know that this was so-and-so's book. And there are people who collect, they don't care as much about the books, they care about the book plates. Oh, this was a book plate of this person or this artist. Paul Revere printed book plates. And I assure you, if you have an engraved, printed, hand-done book plate by Paul Revere, that has value. If it's in a book that has to do with Boston or even better, and then the person might have their name. If it happened to be, and I don't know that this is the case, John Hancock, let's say, had a book plate, then that would be something, because there's that association. Also, people like to be able to track the books and where they came from, and, whether the book plate is something that was formally done, or if someone just wrote an ownership signature on the book saying, this is my book. In most cases, in 99.9% of the time, the fact that you write in the book doesn't help the value. It doesn't make that much difference. I would like to think of a huge ego of myself, but if I write Ken Gloss in a random book, it does not add to the value, unless it's to my daughters or relatives or friends. But there are times when people say, wow, this is a book from Charles Dickens's library, and he had a book plate. Now, one of the things you also have to worry about a little with the book plate is, did someone get a bunch of book plates separate and then stop pasting them in the books and say, I've got a book by Charles Dickens? And there are some very famous ones. Now, one of the things in Boston, when George Washington died, he had a library and in Mount Vernon. And of course, I'm talking about well in Boston. But his relatives sold off and gave away a lot of his possessions. I mean, it was Uncle George. And obviously they knew he was someone very important, but not, if a friend wanted something, not the huge value they are now. But when the people who owned, which was sort of a society ownership, the Boston Athenaeum, when they heard that George Washington's part of his library was going to be for sale, they sent one of their agents down and they bought it. So at the Boston Athenaeum on Beacon Street near the Boston State House, the Boston Athenaeum has a whole collection of books that were in George Washington's library. And George Washington signed his name in the front of each of his books. So you can look at the signature, hand done. You know that he held the book, that he touched it, that he wrote his name in it. Now, at the time, they paid a fair price for it. If you could now, and they show up every once in a great while, if you could get a book that came from George Washington's library, all you need is 20, 30, $40,000, maybe even 50, to just get a simple book from his library. So, because you're going, this was owned and touched and held, and it meant something to him that he actually bought a copy of this. One of the famous people in the early days of the country was Thomas Jefferson. He signed his books, but he also put his initials on certain pages of the books, so that if you could he could always tell if someone had maybe borrowed a book, and it wasn't obvious that his name was on it. I don't remember which pages he did that on, but he did it. Now, also, Thomas Jefferson's library went to the Library of Congress. He needed money, and he sold a lot, and the U.S. government bought his library. But then what happened is, in the War of 1812, a lot of the books were burned, and they have a catalog of it, and they're trying to replace books that were in his library. You obviously can't get his copy, but every once in a while on the market, a copy shows up that was Thomas Jefferson's. And so people love the idea of the association, that if you have a book plate, the book plate itself, if it was done by a famous artist, there are whole societies of book plate collectors. But what I particularly like is having the book plate in the book and identifying a person's library. And then sometimes you know that if they had someone famous do their book plate, they're probably well known. And I've had many times customers or myself go into research and figure out, well, who was this person? Why would they have this book? It can lead you right down a whole rabbit hole in a way. And it's just one aspect that most people would never, ever think of. But there are also people who are absolutely impassioned. And the other thing with it is that a lot of the book plates are not high priced. They're very nicely designed. And it's in an area other than if you're getting into George Washington, Paul Revere, those, for a relatively reasonable amount of money.
Ken, let me ask you this.
Hundreds of these.
Let me ask you this. Are there more contemporary figures with book-plated books that would be of value? I mean, you mentioned some of the greats, the founding fathers, but let's say anyone from the 20th century?
Oh, sure. I mean, any of the presidents. There are people who, in other words, if you have a book from Theodore Roosevelt's library, from John Kennedy's library, if you have a book from, let's say, Margaret Mitchell's library, if someone's famous, if someone had a book from Muhammad Ali's library, there would be a million people who would want to have that association. So if someone's very well known, very famous, I would love to have a book from, let's say, Linus Pauling's library. I studied chemistry. And if this was his textbook that he used. Now, what would make that even better is if he had made notes or margins or written in the book, which for most people, again, I ask people when I go to their house, have you underlined, written, made markings? And if they say yes, usually we won't buy the books. I assure you, though, if it was Albert Einstein in his book and he made notes and margins in it, or if it was Joe DiMaggio's book, or someone who you wouldn't think of as a writer, but they did it. It's what people love is being that association with somebody that they like, admire, collect, enjoy. If George Gershwin wrote a bar of music, or if it was a book that he had on music and he made notes that, oh, this would go well with this, or that would go well with that, or even if it was some obscure book and it just had his name in it. My wife used to collect books on American music. Even if it was an obscure book that had nothing to do with his music, if it had George Gershwin's name, she would have loved it. And I assure you would have paid a premium for it.
The demand for the thing that you really aspire to get that makes it valuable.
Yeah, and it's the association, being able to touch and hold and look at that item and say, George Gershwin had this. George Washington had this. It brings you closer to them. And of course, if you're really interested in that person, I mean, why do people like signatures from athletes, from musicians, from pop culture figures, from presidents? It brings you closer. And the more deeper you dive into it, you go, and it's a matter of prestige too. It's being able to say, hey, look, I've got one of these, you don't. And that's part of what collecting is too.
Absolutely. I hope and I trust that that listener is satisfied with a great reaction from you. And we'll be doing more of these requests for commentary as we go further. So thank you, Ken.
I love getting the feedback. I love getting the commentary. And what I do, every once in a while, we get some that are a little too complicated for a podcast or not enough people would even understand. And I do answer all of them privately if necessary, too. So it's fun to hear. And sometimes it leads me in a path that I never would have thought of going to.
And that's what makes it so much fun. Thank you to Ken. We'll see you next time on the Brattlecast.
Well, thank you, Jordan.